Hello everybody, and welcome to a talk about listening. Yes, there's a certain irony to that, isn't there? A talk about listening. My name is Paul Vittes, and here's a picture of me on the first slide, very much in listening mode. And one of the things I'm doing in that coaching session with my client is listening with my eyes, which is a very important part of listening, and unfortunately something that is extremely difficult to do online. Now, this NewMR event is entitled "Is Listening the New Asking?" It's a provocative question, and it's one that I would challenge because it could suggest that listening and asking are in opposition or they're alternatives. And that would be a false debate because listening and asking feed off each other. We listen, and that raises questions which we ask. We ask questions, and we listen to the answers. A lot of learning is through feedback loops where there's listening and asking feeding off each other. A lot of so-called online listening is actually online observing. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's observing, it's not listening. We should be listening and observing, we should also be asking and questioning, and we should be taking every opportunity to understand and empathise, and at times respect and simply accept what people are saying. We build rapport in that process of understanding. Even if we're not asking questions to the audience, we should be regularly asking questions to our clients and throughout asking questions to ourselves. So the asking is an extremely important part of this. Now, some of you may have heard the phrase, we have two eyes, two ears, one mouth, and we should use them in the same proportions. It's often used to encourage people to think about talking too much and not listening and observing enough. So it's very useful. But what it does also remind us is that listening is not enough. Just listening is not enough. On this next slide, I raise the question, are researchers really listening? Do they want to listen? Do they have the desire? Do they have the ability? Have they got the skills? I regularly do workshops with researchers and other executives, and they tell me that politicians don't listen, PR officers don't listen, advisors to politicians don't listen, they're trained to ask leading questions. They tell me incredible stories about doctors not listening, managers not listening, sometimes their own manager not listening. But then I throw in, well, what about researchers? Well, we listen, they say. We listen, in fact, we're trained to listen. So I say, okay, well, what training have you had in listening? And then it emerges that they've actually had very little training in listening and developing their listening skills. Then they start thinking about lots of scenarios where they don't actually listen very much at all. They don't listen in interviews a lot of the time because they have their head buried in a questionnaire with 60 questions. They're not listening in focus groups often because there's so much else going on around a focus group. There's not much time left for listening. I'll come back to that. And sometimes we get into false debates about whether we should be using offline methods or online methods, and missing the point that underlying this, we're not listening. We're not listening offline, and we're not listening online. Now, in terms of online listening, it's often thrown at us that this is something new and exciting and it's led to more opportunities to listen. But has it led to more effective listening? To some extent, I would say it has. It has created new opportunities for more effective listening. And in other respects, it hasn't at all. We've actually gone backwards. I mean, just look at some of those LinkedIn groups every day where researchers are not listening to each other, talking over each other, typing furiously to argue with each other. Sometimes there's a lot missing in terms of listening. But there has been an accidental revolution, and it's a wonderful, wonderful example of what happens when something new comes along. Because with established tools and techniques, they tend to become tools of control. Clients like to control, researchers like to control. Now, the web is a beautiful battle between freedom of expression and control, between chaos and order. And every time something new comes along, it frees us up for a period until we start to try and control it. And what's actually been happening is that in some of this new online listening or online observing, we've had more freedom. We've had more freedom to explore. Whereas in our focus groups, a typical moderator is going off to a group with a discussion guide or a topic guide with 5 or 6 pages worth of material. They've got 2 bags full of projected techniques and stimulus materials. They've got boards, they've got videos. When they get to the venue, the client throws another video at them and 2 boards they've just designed at the office. And also, can you stage manage that discussion that we had last week, because the general manager is going to be watching tonight. So basically we create a lot of anti-listening structures with no time to listen. Whereas in some of this new research that's being carried out on online conversations, the brief's often very loose. What are people saying about us? Is it positive? Is it negative? So there's a one-off opportunity, at least a honeymoon period, where we can use this freedom to do better research and to listen. But we still have to address the underlying problem. And the underlying problem is actually part of a bigger picture. It's not just a research issue. There's problems in terms of listening in society. There's problems in terms of listening within our education system, within government, within business. Two problems. One is people not listening, and the other is the skills of listening not being taught. Now, in terms of the underlying problem and the bigger picture problem, when we go out and talk to customers, consumers, users of public services, citizens, employees, etc., they often tell us that the problem is they don't feel listened to. That's the problem. We do not feel listened to. That's what they say again and again. People are not listening to the purpose and meaning of what I'm saying. They're not listening to the important issues that I'm raising. They're not listening to the beliefs that I'm expressing here. So what do? We get even more superficial, and we start doing things like online surveillance. Now, online surveillance and online analysis of people's conversations is not going to make them feel listened to. So we would not be addressing the underlying problem. Now, thankfully, we have some wonderful tools, models, great stuff from NLP, for instance, coaching, counselling, all these great disciplines, educational psychology. We now actually know a lot about listening and how to listen effectively. When I started doing a coaching course, trained as a coach back in 1996, I did 2 half-day modules on listening skills. Now, at that point, I'd been a researcher for over 10 years. But I'd never had any training explicitly in listening skills. Suddenly here I was getting the training. And then I did a counselling course, 8 weeks worth of training in listening skills. Nowhere in research had I ever had access to that. And I learnt the tools of deep empathic listening. So there's lots for researchers to learn, lots of tools for us out. Now, we can get bogged down in some of this stuff, but here's a series of questions which I'd throw out to get us thinking about what's important here. Why are we listening is one good question. Is it just because we can? What are the benefits? What are the ethical issues? If we don't address the ethical agenda, we're not professional researchers, we're just a bunch of online mavericks like everybody else out there. What's the bigger picture? Are we really listening to people? Are we letting them set the agenda? Are we feeding back to them what we've found? Are we taking action? And are they seeing that they're being listened to? Are they feeling they've been listened to? Now, some online tools, like online communities, provide a wonderful opportunity to feed back. And this is what companies are doing, feeding back results, action, and making people feel, yes, this is worthwhile. So that's a great development. That's a great benefit. We're now in the post-peak attention world, if you look at the analogy with peak oil. And so we really are now desperately competing for people's attention. But we shouldn't run away from that and actually say, well, we're not going to engage with them at all, we're just going to listen in on what they're saying. We should be trying to crack this issue of engaging with them and making them feel really listened to. This final slide is a summary of a project, a campaign, a LinkedIn group. This started with a big ideas for breakfast meeting at a cafe in Sydney, where we have breakfast together and have to have 3 big ideas before we finish breakfast. It's a wonderful initiative. And we thought, let's come up with a big issue, and also let's see if we can take it from an idea to something big. And we all agreed that there's this global issue with poor listening, lack of teaching of listening skills in schools, etc., etc. So we wanted to build a community of people who shared our passion around this issue, do some research, and then unleash a campaign. We set up a LinkedIn group because LinkedIn is a marvellous tool with 100 million people on it globally and over 1 million in Australia. It actually got 1 million users in Australia before they even employed anybody here, which is amazing. So we set up a group on LinkedIn called Listen Here, the Global Campaign for Effective Listening. And we got 100 movers and shakers from around the world within the space of 2 weeks, with 50% being active on the board. So that's a remarkable achievement already. and we've now got another 50 joining in the second week, and the spread is growing all the time. So I'm hoping that we can come back in 12 months' time and say this idea has gone from being an idea of breakfast in a cafe in Sydney to a global campaign and a global change process. And we've done that through using online tools. We've also done it by making sure that we listen effectively, and then we campaign on listening as well as listening to people along the way. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to me today. Thank you very much to Ray and Helen and the team for organising this event. You've been listening to Paul Vittes of the Vittes Organisation.